Oh, hello, and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to talk about one of my favorite bands of all time, because the driving force behind this band, lead singer and principal writer Mark Hollis, was born on this day, sadly died in 2019. But his musical legacy lives on. Now, Talk Talk is a band that straight out of the gate were great. Some of the more snobby critics only like the later stuff, but their debut album from 1982, called The Party's Over, is chock full of hits. In fact, I would argue that every song on that album was single material. It was just so well written, well produced, super high energy. And yes, it was in that classic 80s style. You've got the latest polysynths of the day creating the melody and chordal structure, loads of drum machine and Simmons drums, the works. It sounds like pop music in 1982 in terms of the sound palette, but in terms of the songwriting quality and the performance, it was definitely a cut above your average throwaway pop by far. And the second album, It's My Life from '84, sort of continued in this vein again. Wonderful songwriting. The song It's My Life, of course, got a second life, if you will, when Gwen Stefani of No Doubt did her version of it in the early 2000s. Just a great song, but such a shame. Another great song. Tomorrow Started, another great song. And you can tell already that in spite of a sort of up-tempo poppy production of the 80s, Mark Hollis's writing definitely had a darker hue, a more introspective nature than your average sort of a typical 80s pop song. No Walking on Sunshine for he. But the album that both fans and critics really embrace is something from 1986 called The Color of Spring. Now, this album tended to ditch a lot of that 80s production style. The drum machines were gone. The Simmons drums were replaced by there were still some drum machines, to be fair, but they weren't used in that typical in-your-face manner. There was real Hammond organ, there was real guitar. It was much more of an organic production than the kind of stuff that you'd tend to find on your typical 80s pop album, particularly the early stuff. And they also brought in many of the great and good, famous musicians from across the worlds of rock, jazz, fusion, and others. I mean, you had Steve Winwood on the Hammond organ, which that alone is great. You have the great UK-based jazz bass player Danny Thompson. He was playing his upright contrabasso. You had Robbie McIntosh on guitar from the Average White Band. You had David Rhodes, wonderful guitarist, probably best known to the wider world for performing with Peter Gabriel. The list goes on. Just some really great people. Alan Gorey, again, Average White Band veteran on the bass. So these are serious musicians. This wasn't just turn on the 808 and let's dance. This was serious music. And by this time, the songwriting of Mark Hollis had become so wonderfully sophisticated, really unlike anything else, unlike anything before or unlike anything since. And you could really say that with the color of spring, they really found their sound. And so what did they do for their follow-up album, which came quite a few years later? I mean, the follow-up was they waited a full 2 years. They weren't just churning them out like a lot of them. But Spirit of Eden in 1988 took that format, if you will, and threw it away. In its place was something very improvisational, very dynamic, very atmospheric, and at times the dynamics were very quiet. This was not an album that you would dance to. This was an album where you turn the lights out and just listen very carefully. Again, one common theme is the great musicians that the band invited to have on the album. Robbie McIntosh makes a reappearance on this album. By this time, Tim Freeze Green is sort of an honorary sort of producer stroke extra member of the album by this time. You have Simon Edwards, wonderful bass player. Danny Thompson was back. Henry Lothar, wonderful trumpet player. Nigel Kennedy, the great sort of classical and fusion violinist at the height of his career at this time, frankly, and he was on the album. Just some really, really great musicians. And this album was the kind of album that the critics loved, but it did alienate some of the fans who thought, right, Color of Spring from 86 was musically sophisticated, but we can still generally dance to it. And it's like, where's the dancing? Where's the toe tapping music? All of that was gone. And the band, Mark Hollis in particular, even said that this sort of reinvention was inspired in many ways by the more avant garde stuff that Miles Davis was doing at the end of the 60s. The final album came in 1991, which was in this same sort of low key, very dynamic, improvisational style that you saw on The Spirit of Eden. Another really, really great album in that same style, very complimentary. And then after that, the band just broke up, never to return. Mark Holness himself came out with a solo album in 1998. Shortly thereafter, he retired from music, and the world didn't really hear much from him. Um, and that was in many ways, it was a classy thing to do. Now, it's kind of a strange thing to do if you grew up around sort of gigging, working musicians who needed to play at least 5 nights a week just to get by. But as a kind of poetry type of aficionado, if you will, we all like a bit of poetry. Mark Hollis did sort of live the life of a musical poet. He came, bursted onto the charts with popularity, then took that popularity and became increasingly avant-garde until saying, right, I've given you all I want to give. That's it. And Talk Talk and Mark Hollis left us with a really interesting musical legacy, one that I don't think will soon be forgotten by anyone, and one that's there to be discovered by new fans. Like, subscribe. We'll see you next time. Take care.